here we go. All right, so let's start out with this idea of what's called periodization training. Periodization training, the whole goal of periodization training is to peak at the right time. Okay, so it's goal number one. Goal number two is to do that while avoiding overtraining. Okay, so it's really all about putting the right amount of stimulus on the training individual to give them the correct amount of adaptation and to get them their fastest, their strongest, whatever it might be, all with the end goal of getting them to peak right at the right time, right at the race. And that's kind of what that looks like there, right at the race time, or maybe that's during conference meet for track or playoffs for basketball or whatever that might be. Okay, and so the basic principles of periodization training include a couple of different things. So when we look at it, we look at the preseason part, which is characterized by high volume and low intensity and skill training. Okay, so that's where, think of this as like your Hell Week in football, right, where you're doing 2-a-day practices. You're not doing anything super duper intense, not doing a ton of sprints or even a ton of skill training. You are doing you're doing high volume, low intensity, and skill training. So you're not doing a ton of high intensity stuff, not a ton of sprints, not a ton of skill training. You're just doing a lot of volume, lots of practice, lots of endurance type stuff. Okay, and then as you move on throughout the season, so you can see this volume graph slowly starts going down, right? And then the intensity graph goes up, and we can have intensity and skill training right along with each other, because those, for the most part, will move together. So volume continually drops as intensity and skill continually go up, and again, all builds towards peaking at the end of the season. Now, this is looking at a single race macro cycle. You could do periodization training each week of a training program, and you can also do periodization training for the whole season. Okay, so there's small micro cycles that occur each week, and then there's the macro cycle that's occurring over the whole season. So bottom line is pre-seasons, high volume, low intensity, low skill training, and then as you move on, volume goes down, intensity and skill go up. That's the bottom line. And then remember these key goals of periodization. Okay, so when we look at using the periodization model of training, the first phase should be blank on volume and blank on intensity, where the last phase should be blank on technique. We can think of that as skill training and blank on volume. Okay, so that first phase should be high on volume and low on intensity, right? So one of these two are canceled out. Okay, and whereas the last phase should be high on skill training and low on volume, right? So we've got, now that one's canceled out. We've got C, high on skill training, low on volume. All right. And all of this centers around the idea of the FIT principle, which is known as frequency, intensity, time, and type. And you can see that here. You guys have already we've talked about this related to that lab. And so, so if we used to do this in class, I would have you kind of apply the FIT principle to stretching, cardiovascular fitness, or muscular strength gains. But we already did some of that in the lab stuff that you did. Okay. Oops, sorry. A couple other brief things about training that are important to understand. A warm-up. Why do we do a warm-up? The warm-up is obviously to increase temperature, but not just of your whole body, but of your cells, of your tissues. Increases the temperature to optimal functioning point of our enzymes, proteins, and also increase blood flow. So how long does it typically take to do a warm-up? Somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. And you know you're ready when you start to break a little sweat, right? It's a little bit of slight sweating. Your body is warm, okay? And then after that, you want to start your activity within 15 minutes while you still have that light sweat going. Okay, and then lastly, a cool down. Obviously, that's not how you do a cool down, but how you do it is just light activity, right? Nothing fancy about that. And the reason why is all about venous return, right? So using that muscle pump to get venous return going, to clear out some of the damaged cells and damaged proteins and things that might be in those blood pools. So we want to minimize blood pooling, which is going to eventually limit soreness by limiting inflammation. And then stretching. Um, Passive stretching is kind of the basic way to do it, right? Where you're just putting your joint on a stretch, going until it feels uncomfortable, and then just holding it there, right? So should we stretch or not? Well, it really depends, right? We could have a lot of discussion on this. I'm sure you've had some of this in other classes, but the bottom line is there is some research out there that shows that static stretching right before uh, a sprint type activity or a power type activity will decrease power output a little bit. Okay, but then you don't see that same thing not with dynamic stretching. So that'd be like running and doing like those butt kickers, right, to stretch your quads, or running and lifting your knees up to your chest to stretch out your hamstring, doing things like that. Dynamic stretching, we don't see that same effect. Okay, and then this effect only lasts for a certain matter of minutes. We're not exactly sure how long. So if you do this stretching a couple hours, if you do passive stretching a couple hours before your activity, then you probably won't see this decline in power output. And if you're a long distance person, you're probably not that worried about this because you don't need a ton of power and sprint ability when you first start your race. Maybe you do towards the end and at different points, but this is probably a small factor for endurance athletes. So, yeah. So the acute effect, decreased power with static stretching, dynamic may be okay. And then the chronic effects are, yeah, we can definitely increase flexibility, but does that increase or decrease injury rate? We're not really sure. It's pretty hard to actually do a good study that tests this properly. But there's some evidence to show yes. Other evidence is inconclusive. So it makes sense. We all do it. We all naturally feel like we want to stretch, but we don't really know for sure if it decreases injury rate. All right, guys, that's all for this.